What happens when cops abuse their power, thinking no one can hold them accountable? They humiliate a man without realizing he's the one who controls their future. What happened next changed the city forever. The air was crisp, the kind that carried a hint of autumn even though summer still had its grip on the city. A light breeze moved through the tree-lined streets, rustling the perfectly trimmed hedges in front of spotless suburban homes. Everything about this neighborhood screamed upper-class serenity, the kind of place where the sidewalks were power-washed every weekend, where kids rode their bikes without fear, and where the biggest controversy was whether someone let their grass grow half an inch too tall. He walked at an easy, unhurried pace, his polished dress shoes clicking softly against the pavement. It was a habit now, this evening stroll, this moment of solitude. His day had been long, filled with endless meetings, back-to-back calls, and the exhausting dance of diplomacy. The suit he wore, dark, tailored, sharp, was a second skin by now, though he loosened his tie just a bit, allowing himself this one small rebellion against the formality of his position. He breathed in deep, letting the silence settle over him like a warm blanket. This was his time, his space. No emails, no calls, no questions, no problems to solve, just him, the quiet and the comforting rhythm of his own footsteps. Then, in an instant, the peace shattered. A sharp yelp, the screech of claws against concrete, a frantic, high-pitched voice. "Oh no! Oh no! Stop! Stop!" His head snapped toward the sound. Just a few feet ahead, an elderly woman, maybe mid-70s, dressed in a pastel sweater that looked soft enough to sleep in, was gripping the end of an empty leash, her hands shaking. Her mouth hung open in sheer panic as her dog, a massive golden Labrador, bolted down the sidewalk, straight toward the street. The dog wasn't just running, it was on a mission. Its paws pounded against the pavement, muscles tensed with excitement, tail wagging like a propeller. The moment it saw freedom, it had taken it. No hesitation, no second thoughts. And now it was seconds away from sprinting into the road. He didn't think, didn't pause, didn't weigh his options. He moved, one long stride, then another. His shoes barely made contact with the ground before he lunged forward, stretching out one hand. Got him. His fingers wrapped around the thick leather of the dog's collar, just as its front paws hovered over the curb. One sharp tug, a firm grip, and just like that, the escape attempt was over. The dog twisted its head, startled, then blinked up at him, tongue lolling out, like it hadn't just nearly gotten itself flattened by oncoming traffic. The old woman gasped, one hand clutching her chest like her heart had tried to leap out of it. "Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness!" She hurried forward, eyes wide with shock. Oh bless you, honey! She sucked in a breath, placing a trembling hand on the dog's back. "You saved my baby. Thank you. I don't even know what to say." He gave her a small smile, smoothing down his sleeves where the quick motion had disturbed them. "All good, ma'am. Just be careful next time." She was still shaking, still holding her chest, still looking at him like he had just performed some kind of divine intervention. And then, just as he was about to turn back to his walk, a voice, sharp, cold, unfamiliar. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Something about the way it sliced through the air made his stomach turn. His body stiffened. Slowly, he turned. Two cops, both white, both in pristine uniforms, the kind that looked like they had been ironed that morning. Their strides were confident, controlled, too controlled. And their eyes? They weren't looking at the dog. They weren't looking at the old woman either. They were looking at him. And he already knew. This wasn't about a dog. This was about him. There was something about the way they walked. Deliberate, steady, controlled. Not fast enough to be chasing, but not slow enough to be casual either. Their posture was stiff, hands resting close to their belts, chin slightly lifted, like they had already decided how this interaction was going to play out before they even got close. It was a scene he had witnessed before, on the news, in documentaries, in viral videos that always ended the same way. a routine stop, a quick question, a simple misunderstanding that somehow always required backup. He could already feel it, the shift in the air, not the cooling evening breeze that had been so pleasant just moments ago. No, this was different. This was the kind of shift that made you hyper-aware of your own breath, of your own hands, of every inch of space between you and them. The older officer, probably mid-40s, was the first to speak. He had that look, deep-set eyes, a jaw that seemed permanently clenched, skin that looked like it had spent years bracing against the wind. A man who had been doing this job long enough to know exactly how to throw his weight around without ever having to raise his voice. "Do you live around here?" Not a greeting, not a, "Hey, how's your evening going?" Just straight to the point. The man didn't flinch, didn't blink. He met the officer's gaze, his expression calm, unreadable. "I'm taking a walk after work." Neutral, unprovocative, no attitude. The second officer, younger, a little too eager, took a step forward. "Did someone give you permission to walk here?" That one made him pause. Permission? His lips pressed together in something that almost resembled a smile. Thin, humorless, the kind you give someone when you know they just said something ridiculous, but you want to give them a chance to realize it on their own. "Permission?" he repeated, tilting his head slightly. "Is this private property?" The older officer's expression didn't change. "Not your concern," he said flatly. "Just show me some ID." Ah, there it was. No small talk, no attempt to disguise the implication, the demand, the assumption, the unspoken rule that in certain places certain people were always required to explain themselves. He had spent a lifetime navigating these moments, knowing exactly how much eye contact to make, exactly how still to stand, exactly how to measure his words so they wouldn't be mistaken for aggression. The old woman, still clutching the leash, took a hesitant step forward. She looked between the officers and the man who had just saved her dog, disbelief etched into her features. "Officers, he just helped me. My dog, he could have been hit by a car. This man is a hero, for goodness sake." Her voice wavered between confusion and outrage, like she truly could not comprehend how a good deed had so quickly turned into an interrogation. The younger officer barely glanced at her. "Ma'am, step back. We're handling it." Handling what, exactly? The man didn't move, didn't reach for his wallet, didn't break eye contact. "Am I being detained?" That question. A simple one. Straightforward. Yet, somehow, it always changed the temperature of these conversations. The older officer let out a slow breath, the kind someone takes when they're trying very hard to stay patient. "Just routine. If you've got nothing to hide, this won't take long." Routine. Right. Because this, stopping a well-dressed man on a quiet evening stroll, was standard practice. Because this, acting like he needed clearance to walk down a sidewalk, was just a normal part of community policing. Because this wasn't about what he had done, this was about what they thought he was capable of doing, and they had already decided. The officer lifted his radio and pressed the button. His voice was calm, professional, detached. "Possible 1063, suspicious individual." 1063, suspicious person. The label settled over him like a weight. Not concerned citizen. Not man taking a walk. Not guy who just saved a runaway dog. Just suspicious. The old woman gasped. "Suspicious? What are you talking about? He didn't do anything." The officers ignored her. And the man, he just stood there. Still, controlled. His fingers curled slightly at his sides, pressing into the soft fabric of his tailored slacks. Not in fear, not in anger, just in quiet, practiced restraint, because he knew. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about crime. This was about control. And the worst part? It was all happening by the book. The younger cop was the first to break the silence. He had that cocky, rehearsed way of talking, the kind that made it clear he wasn't interested in having a conversation, just proving a point. "Listen, buddy," he said, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. "We've had some thefts in the area lately, and you know what's funny?" He paused, tilting his head, letting the smirk creep onto his face. "You kind of match the description." The man let the words hang in the air, measuring them. Then, slowly, deliberately, he met the officer's eyes. "Let me guess," he said, voice smooth but firm. "Black?" The two officers exchanged a glance. It was quick, barely a flicker, but it was there. That silent confirmation, that unspoken agreement. They didn't have to answer. The answer was already obvious. "You're acting suspicious," the older cop finally said, his tone shifting from casual to clipped. "And since you're out here wandering around, we need to make sure you understand how things work in this neighborhood." His gaze dropped pointedly to the ground, and then he gestured to a small, steaming pile of fresh dog waste sitting near the curb. "Pick it up." For a moment, the world went completely silent. The man didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. He wasn't sure if he had heard that right. What?" The younger cop crossed his arms, shifting his weight like he was settling in for a long conversation. "You heard me." He nodded toward the mess. "Go ahead, pick it up." The older officer added, almost lazily, "You don't want any trouble, do you? If you've got nothing to hide, this shouldn't be a problem." There it was, that same tired playbook, the illusion of choice. The man could feel the old woman's stare burning into the side of his face. He didn't turn to look at her, but he heard it, her sharp inhale, the slight gasp of disbelief. "This is humiliating," she burst out, voice trembling with anger. The younger cop barely spared her a glance. "Ma'am," he said, voice flat, "you were told not to interfere." Her breath hitched, but she didn't move. And him? He just stood there, jaw tight, hands relaxed at his sides, but only because he was making them relax. Because this wasn't about a pile of dog waste. This was about power. They wanted to see how far they could push. They wanted to see if he'd break, if he'd get angry, if he'd react in a way that would justify whatever they had already decided to do. It wasn't new. It wasn't even creative. It was just a different version of the same old test. His voice came out calm, controlled. "You're joking." The younger cop raised an eyebrow. "Nope." The man exhaled slowly, shaking his head just slightly. "You seriously want me to pick up a random dog's mess off the street?" The officer shrugged. "If you don't want people thinking you're suspicious, prove you're a good citizen." His teeth pressed together, and for the first time in a long time, he felt it. That slow burn deep in his chest, that quiet, simmering rage that came from knowing, no matter what I do, I lose. His fingers twitched at his sides, not in anger, not in fear, just in restraint. And he wasn't about to give them what they wanted. The anger was creeping up his spine, slow and deliberate, like molten metal pooling in his gut. It wasn't the wild kind of rage, the type that made people lose control. No, this was something sharper, calculated, focused, refined over years of knowing exactly when to bite back and when to let the fire simmer just beneath the surface. He had been in situations like this before. Different places, different faces, same energy. That smug authority, the slow and deliberate escalation, the performance of giving him a choice when there was never really a choice to begin with. But this was new. This was them looking him in the face, deciding he didn't belong, and forcing him into a position where no answer was the right one. And he wasn't going to play along. His voice was steady, firm, unshaken. "I refuse." For a moment, just a split second, there was silence. Then the younger officer's smirk twitched, just slightly, just enough to show that he hadn't expected that answer. The older one? He smiled, not the kind of smile that meant good choice, the kind of smile that meant wrong move. "Oh, yeah?" His tone was light, almost amused, as if the man standing before him had just done something deeply entertaining. "That so?" He shifted his weight, tilting his head ever so slightly toward his partner. And that's when it happened. The younger officer adjusted his stance. His fingers, which had been resting so casually on his belt, twitched ever so slightly, just enough to make a statement. Click. The sound was quiet, barely more than a whisper of metal and leather, but it sliced through the moment like a blade. It was subtle, intentional, a message. The elderly woman gasped. "No, no, no, you can't." Her voice cracked on the last word, her hands clutching the leash tighter. The older cop didn't even look at her. "Ma'am," he said, tone exasperated, like she was the one being unreasonable. "Step back." She didn't move, and in that moment she knew exactly what was about to happen. The old script, the slow escalation, the casual flex of power disguised as just doing our job. "Listen," the older cop continued, his voice still frustratingly smooth. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the hard way." The younger one sighed, shaking his head, playing up the theatrics of it all. "Last chance, buddy. You pick it up, or we take a ride downtown." There it was. No pretense anymore, no legal justification, just a choice between humiliation and handcuffs. His jaw tightened, but his face remained perfectly still. Every muscle in his body wanted to react, to push back, to do something. But he knew the game, knew the stakes, and knew that one wrong move, one sign of frustration, one too quick motion, could flip this entire situation into something he wouldn't be able to control. So, instead, he did what they least expected. He stood his ground. Calm, controlled. "And what," he asked, his voice measured, "is the charge?" The younger cop's fingers drummed lightly against his belt. "We'll figure that out when we get there." There it was, the final confirmation that this had never been about law, never been about justice. This was about power, and they were daring him to challenge it. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was thick, loaded, pressing against his skin like the weight of something unseen but unmistakably present. This was a moment where he could feel every set of eyes on him, the two officers watching him with barely restrained amusement. The old woman, her mouth slightly open, her fingers still clenched around the leash like it was the only thing grounding her in this surreal nightmare. The whole street empty, but suddenly too aware, like even the houses were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. He inhaled slowly, controlled, measured, and then, just as deliberately, he lowered his gaze. First to his shoes, polished leather, imported, designed for boardrooms and fundraisers, not for bending to someone else's idea of obedience. Then to the ground, the mess, the insult, the order he never should have had to follow. Finally, his eyes flicked to the old woman. She looked horrified, guilty, like she wanted to scream but had no idea what words would be enough. And he realized she understood. Maybe not the full depth of it, maybe not in the way he did, but enough to know that this wasn't about trash on the sidewalk. This was about dominance. This was about making a man kneel without ever saying the words. His jaw clenched just slightly, but his face remained unreadable. Then, without a single wasted motion, he bent down. He could feel them watching, feel the shift in the air, the quiet satisfaction rolling off the officers in waves. He reached for the plastic bag they had so generously supplied, pulled it over his hand, and then, without hesitation, he picked up the mess. The bag crinkled in his grip as he straightened. His movements were slow, purposeful, every second stretching longer than it should. The older officer's smirk widened, arms folding over his chest like he had just won a game neither of them had agreed to play. "There you go," he said, nodding with the casual arrogance of a man who thought he had made his point. "Now, you can be on your way." The younger one let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" The condescension in his voice made something sharp coil in the mayor's chest. He let them bask in their little victory for exactly 3 more seconds. Then, with practiced ease, he straightened his cuffs, smoothed down his suit jacket, and lifted his eyes to theirs, calm, controlled, unshaken. "Officers," he said, voice steady, even, just the right amount of unimpressed. "Do you know who I am?" The smirk on the older officer's face didn't waver, but there was a flicker, small, barely perceptible, but there. The younger one scoffed. "Doesn't matter. The older one tilted his head, crossing his arms tighter. Yeah, he agreed. Who cares? The mayor's lips pressed together in something that wasn't quite a smile. Then, without another word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed. He didn't look at the screen, didn't need to. He just lifted it to his ear, his gaze never breaking from theirs. The old woman sucked in a sharp breath. The younger officer shifted. Not much, just enough. The first ring echoed in the stillness. The second. And then, a voice. The mayor didn't blink, didn't raise his voice, didn't smirk. "This is the mayor," he said, his words cutting through the thick air like a blade. "I need a unit at my location. Now." Silence. Thicker this time. He could see it, feel it, the second they registered what he had just said. The shift, the power-changing hands. The younger officer blinked. Once, twice. The older one's jaw tightened, his smirk faltering just slightly before he forced it back into place. The mayor exhaled slowly, lowering the phone from his ear, his fingers tapping once against the screen before he slid it back into his pocket. Then he looked at them and waited. The shift in the air was immediate. A second ago, these two officers had been standing with the confidence of men who knew they were in control, the kind of confidence that comes from years of getting away with just enough, the little abuses of power that never made headlines, the quiet humiliations that never had consequences. But now that confidence had cracked. The younger cop, the one who had been so smug, so sure of himself just a moment ago, was pale. Not just surprised. No, this was deeper than that. This was panic. His lips parted slightly, like his brain was trying to form words, but couldn't quite get past the weight of what he had just heard. What? It came out strangled, unsure. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his gaze flicking between his partner and the man standing before him, like he was hoping someone would tell him this wasn't real. But it was. The older cop, the one who had been running this little power trip with the smug authority of a man who thought he had the final say, had lost that casual smirk. His brows pulled together, deep lines forming on his forehead, his lips pressed into a thin line. "What mayor?" he asked, his voice lower now, less relaxed, less sure. He was trying to stay in control, trying to hold on to the authority that had been slipping from his grip the second the word mayor had entered the conversation. The mayor, didn't answer right away. Didn't have to, because it was already too late. The realization was sinking in. The younger cop turned to his partner, looking for reassurance, for a way out of this, for some kind of unspoken confirmation that they weren't about to step into something much bigger than they had anticipated. None came. And the silence that followed, it was deafening. The old woman, who had been gripping her dog's leash like a lifeline, let out a tiny, barely audible gasp. The kind of sound someone makes when they realize they've been watching a slow-motion disaster unfold, but only now understand the full scope of what they're witnessing. Finally, the mayor spoke, calm, even, like a man who knew he was in control. "The one who signed the police reform bill." 6 simple words, but they hit like a sledgehammer. The older cop exhaled sharply through his nose. His shoulders stiffened. His fingers twitched at his sides, like he was trying to decide what his next move should be. His entire demeanor had changed. Not quite apologetic, but no longer aggressive. Now he was assessing, recalibrating. The younger officer, still a step behind, let out a nervous huff. He shook his head slightly, trying to reassemble whatever shattered pieces of authority he had left. "You're joking." The mayor didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't say a word, just watched. And that was when they knew. They had just made the biggest mistake of their careers. The younger cop shifted uncomfortably. His mouth opened, like he wanted to say something, maybe a defense, maybe an excuse, maybe some ridiculous attempt at doubling down. But nothing came out, because what could he say? He had ordered the mayor to pick up dog waste. The older cop ran a hand over his jaw, his lips pressing tighter. He was still standing tall, still trying to hold on to whatever authority he had left, but the shift in his stance was obvious. He wasn't in control anymore. And he knew it. The mayor let the silence stretch, let them feel it. Then, slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed. He didn't even look at the screen. Didn't need to. The younger cop tensed. His breathing was faster now, his gaze darting between the phone and his partner, waiting for some kind of instruction, some kind of out. The first ring echoed in the quiet street, then the second. And then a voice answered. The mayor didn't hesitate, didn't raise his voice, didn't break eye contact. "This is the mayor," he said, voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I need a unit at my location. Now." And just like that, the power shifted. The quiet of the neighborhood didn't last long. It started with a low rumble, distant at first, barely noticeable over the sound of the breeze rustling through the trees. Then came the distinct wail of sirens, cutting through the stillness of the manicured suburb like a blade. One car, then another, then another. Within minutes, the peaceful, picture-perfect street was flooded with flashing lights, reflecting off the pristine white fences and the glossy windows of the luxury homes. The officers who had been so confident minutes ago, they weren't confident anymore. The younger one had stopped shifting from foot to foot. Now he was frozen, his hands stiff at his sides, his lips pressed together like he was holding his breath. The older one had his jaw clenched so tight it looked like his teeth might snap under the pressure. His shoulders were squared, his back stiff, but there was no hiding the tension rolling off him in waves, because they knew. The moment those sirens came closer, the moment the first car turned onto the street, their fate was sealed. And then a black SUV pulled up, engine humming with restrained power. The driver's side door swung open, and out stepped the one man they really didn't want to see, the police chief. He moved fast, too fast. He wasn't strolling, he wasn't taking his time. He was practically storming toward them, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable, except for his eyes. His eyes were locked on the mayor, and when he got close enough to see the expression on his boss's face, the color drained from his own. "Sir," his voice cracked just slightly before he cleared his throat and tried again. "Sir, this is a—" He hesitated, searching for the right word, something that wouldn't make this worse. Finally, he landed on, "a misunderstanding." The mayor didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't buy it for a second. "Oh," he said, his voice calm, measured, perfectly controlled. "A misunderstanding?" The chief exhaled sharply, shifting on his feet. "Sir, if I had known—" But the mayor didn't let him finish. His next words cut through the chief's weak attempt at damage control like a knife. "You really think I'm going to forget this?" The officers who had started this mess didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe, because they already knew. There was no talking their way out of this. The flashing blue and red police lights weren't the only thing illuminating the night anymore. The entire scene had transformed. It wasn't just cops and official vehicles now. No, this had turned into something much bigger. Bright white camera flashes exploded against the dark sky, capturing every movement, every reaction, every single second of this unfolding disaster. Journalists, an entire pack of them, had taken over the sidewalk in front of the police station, microphones raised, cameras rolling, voices overlapping in a chaotic storm of urgency. They had been waiting. They had seen the sirens. They had heard the whispers. And the moment the story started leaking online, because, of course, it had, they descended like sharks, catching the scent of blood in the water. Now, the police station entrance was a battleground of flashing cameras and eager voices, all of them fighting to be the first to get the soundbite that would set the internet on fire. The mayor stepped out of the car, straightening his jacket, exuding the kind of authority that made people stop and watch. He didn't rush. He didn't fumble. He didn't even seem fazed by the media storm waiting for him. This wasn't his first time under the spotlight, but the same couldn't be said for the two officers who had started this mess. They were standing just a few feet away, frozen in place like deer caught in headlights. The younger one was visibly shaken, his hands twitching slightly at his sides like he was debating whether to shove them in his pockets or keep them at his hips. His face had lost all its color, his jaw was tight, his eyes were locked on the ground, like if he just stared at the pavement hard enough, he could will himself out of this nightmare. The older officer? He wasn't doing much better. He had been in uniform long enough to know that the press was not something you wanted against you, and tonight, oh, they were against him. His gaze darted from the cameras to the police chief, then back to the mayor. His lips were pressed together in a tight, thin line. The confidence, the smugness, was gone, completely stripped away. Because this was national news now. This wasn't just some small-town incident that could be brushed under the rug with a carefully worded statement. This was being documented in real time. Somewhere, on 1,000 different phones and live streams, his face was being recorded, uploaded, and dissected. Somewhere, people were already watching. Somewhere, there were comment sections already filling up with outrage. Somewhere, headlines were being drafted, and none of them were in his favor. He swallowed hard. A reporter pushed forward, practically shoving her microphone into the mayor's face. "Mr. Mayor, is it true that these officers forced you to—" Another journalist cut in. "Sir, what do you have to say about this clear case of racial profiling?" A third voice, sharper, louder. "Do you plan to take legal action against the department?" The younger cop flinched. Legal action. The words landed like a brick between them. The mayor didn't answer. Not yet. He just stood there, letting the moment settle, letting the weight of their mistake fully sink in, because this wasn't something they could walk away from. Not anymore. The younger officer's hand twitched again, like he wanted to lift it, maybe to cover his face, maybe to wave away the cameras, maybe just to do something, but he stopped himself, because he knew. Hiding wouldn't help. Running wouldn't help. Nothing would help. Not now. Not with the world watching. The older cop's breathing had gone shallow. He shifted slightly, straightening his shoulders, trying to regain even a fraction of the control he'd once had. But there was nothing left to salvage, because right now, they weren't officers. They were the story, and there was no escaping it. It started small, a handful of posts on social media, a few angry comments under the first leaked video, some tweets with the words unbelievable and disgusting thrown in for emphasis. But by morning it wasn't just a few posts. By morning, it was everywhere. News outlets ran the footage on repeat. Clips of the officers standing over the mayor, smug and arrogant, ordering him to pick up trash like he was some kind of criminal. Screens flashed with side-by-side images, one of the mayor in a suit, standing behind a podium, signing the police reform bill, the other kneeling on the sidewalk, holding a plastic bag filled with someone else's mess. And people were not having it. The backlash was immediate. The city was buzzing, no, roaring. Outrage flooded the streets like a tidal wave, unstoppable and deafening. Protesters gathered outside the police station before noon, some holding signs that read, "Accountability now," others chanting, their voices echoing off the brick buildings downtown. "Fire them! Fire them!" It wasn't just the usual activists either. It was everyone. Business owners, church groups, teachers, local politicians, people who might not have paid much attention to the issue before, but now it was different. Now it was personal. Because this wasn't just about one man. This wasn't just about the mayor. This was about every person who had ever been harassed, humiliated, or treated like they didn't belong. This was about every moment of disrespect that had been brushed off, every story that had been ignored. This was their moment to push back. And they weren't letting it go. By the time the city council meeting started that evening, the entire chamber was packed. Every seat was filled, people standing along the walls, spilling into the hallways, all of them demanding the same thing. "Remove them from the force!" The police chief sat at the front of the room, looking like he hadn't slept. The officers in question? They weren't there. Probably couldn't be. Probably shouldn't be. Because at this point, Showing their faces would have been like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. People wanted answers. People wanted action. And most of all, people wanted justice. It didn't just stay local. No, this thing spread like wildfire. At first, it was just a few viral posts on social media. Clips from the body cam footage, shaky cell phone recordings from nearby residents, screenshots from local news reports. But by the time the sun came up the next day, this wasn't just another trending story. It was the story. The kind of scandal that made producers scramble to rewrite morning show scripts. The kind of footage that played on a loop behind news anchors as they shook their heads in disbelief. The kind of headline that practically demanded national outrage. And it got exactly that. By 7 a.m., it was all over Good Morning America. The hosts sat around their pristine white news desk, looking appropriately stunned as they introduced the footage for what had to be the 10th time that hour. For those just tuning in, this shocking video shows a sitting mayor being forced to pick up dog waste by two officers who had no idea who they were talking to. Let's roll the clip again. And there it was, again. The footage played in slow motion, zooming in on the smirks, the condescension, the moment the officers realized exactly who they had just humiliated. One of the hosts let out a slow exhale, shaking her head. This is beyond humiliating. This is an abuse of power, plain and simple. The screen split, showing a panel of analysts, former cops, civil rights lawyers, political strategists, all itching to dissect the moment from every possible angle. One of them, a retired police chief, let out a long sigh before speaking. This is why people don't trust us. Incidents like this are why good officers have to fight twice as hard to prove they're actually doing their jobs the right way. Another expert, a well-known journalist, leaned forward in his chair. The irony here is staggering. These officers were enforcing power where it wasn't needed, and the one man who actually had real authority over them let them hang themselves with their own arrogance. The host nodded, eyes narrowing. And now the question is, what happens next? If the news networks were on fire, social media was an inferno. The hashtags were endless. Hash. Fire them now, hash justice, for the mayor, hash police accountability. And of course, the one that really caught on, hash poopgate. Because somehow, despite all the layers of systemic injustice packed into this incident, the internet still found a way to be petty. Twitter, or X as they were calling it now, turned into a full-blown battlefield. One user wrote, "These officers made a man pick up literal trash, and now their careers are in the same spot. Poetic justice." Another post had over 500,000 likes. Imagine making the mayor clean up dog poop just to find out he signs your paychecks. Karma moves fast. And the memes? Oh, the memes were brutal. One of the most viral edits was a slow-motion zoom on the younger officer's face when the mayor pulled out his phone, dramatic music swelling in the background, the caption reading, "That moment you realize you just humiliated the man who controls your department's funding." It got 2.3 million views in less than a day. Another meme featured a fake police training manual, how to identify a suspect, walking while black existing in a nice neighborhood. Wearing a suit, apparently actually doing anything illegal. Even celebrities jumped in. A-list actors, musicians, athletes, all of them retweeting, posting, adding fuel to the fire. An NBA star tweeted, "They really had this man on the sidewalk like a criminal. Fire them now." A famous comedian joked, "So, we just handing out police badges to anybody now? Where's the quality control?" Even a few politicians couldn't resist. If this can happen to a mayor, imagine what happens to regular people with no cameras around. That one hit deep. By the time the Late Show rolled around that evening, the scandal had taken on a life of its own. The host stepped onto the stage, adjusting his suit, already grinning as the audience roared in anticipation. "All right, folks, let's talk about the biggest story of the week. You may have heard about two genius police officers who, get this, made the mayor of their own city clean up dog poop." The crowd howled. The host held up a fake newspaper with a bold headline, "Worst career move in history." Now, correct me if I'm wrong. he continued, flipping through imaginary notes. But isn't the first rule of policing, like, knowing who you work for? More laughter. These guys really had one job. Don't humiliate your own boss in public. And somehow, they fumbled it so bad it became a national scandal. Just incredible. The next morning, the New York Times ran the headline, "When Power Goes to Your Head and Lands You in Trouble." The Washington Post? "This incident isn't just an accident, it's a pattern." And the local papers? They didn't hold back either. Officers humiliate mayor and now face the consequences. Editorials dissected the situation from every angle. Some focused on the power dynamics. Some focused on the police reform bill the mayor had signed, pointing out the sheer irony of the situation. And some, the most brutal ones, pointed out the obvious. If this is how these officers treat the mayor, imagine how they treat everyday citizens. By the time the weekend hit, the officers' names were everywhere. People were demanding action. The police chief was under immense pressure to respond, and the mayor was just watching. Watching as the city, no, the nation, picked apart every detail. Watching as the officers scrambled, as the department fumbled its response, as the story refused to die down. Because this wasn't just another bad cop story. This was a reckoning, and it was only just beginning. The camera lights were blinding. Too bright, too close. The younger officer stood in the middle of the press conference room, surrounded by microphones, reporters, flashing cameras, every single lens trained directly on him. There was no escape, no way to shrink back into the shadows, no way to undo what had already been done. His face was pale, his hands gripping the podium, like it was the only thing keeping him from collapsing under the weight of it all. The mayor wasn't even in the room. He didn't need to be. His presence loomed over everything. Because now the officer wasn't the one asking questions. Now he was the one being judged. The murmurs in the room grew louder as he swallowed hard, his breath uneven. His carefully rehearsed statement, the one his department's PR team had crafted for him, sat on the podium printed on crisp white paper. He had barely read the first line before his voice cracked, and then the floodgates opened. Tears welled up in his eyes, his breath hitching as he tried to hold it together. He couldn't. His shoulders trembled, his lips parted, struggling to form words, and when they finally did, they were weak, shaky, barely above a whisper. I didn't think... His voice cracked again. "I was just following orders." The room went still, not out of sympathy, out of judgment, because everyone had heard this before. "I was just following orders." It wasn't an excuse. It was an admission, a confirmation of what the public already believed. This wasn't about law or justice or even safety. This was about control, about unchecked power, about officers who never questioned whether what they were doing was right. His eyes darted around the room, looking for anything, anyone, that might pull him out of this spiral. But there was no lifeline, no reassuring nods, no understanding glances, just rows of cold, unblinking cameras capturing everything. The reporters didn't stop. "Do you regret your actions?" His breath hitched. He wiped his face with his sleeve, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. Do you think you deserve to keep your job?" Silence. His lips parted, but no words came out, because for the first time he didn't know the answer. He had spent years believing the uniform made him untouchable, that no matter what happened, there would always be a way to spin the story, always a way to make the public forget. But now he was standing in front of the world, exposed, and nobody was coming to save him. The department didn't waste time. They had no choice. The pressure was too big, the backlash too loud, and the evidence too clear. There was no spinning this, no sweeping it under the rug, no quiet reassignment to another district where the public wouldn't notice. People were watching. The media was still running the footage. The protests hadn't stopped. Social media was relentless, demanding accountability with every new viral post. So the decision came down. The official statement from the department was dry, bureaucratic, and cold, just a few short lines released in a press briefing. Effective immediately, Officer Daniel Marsh has been relieved of duty following a thorough review of his conduct in the recent incident involving the mayor. That was it. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, no mention of what he actually did. Just terminated. And when the news broke? The reaction was instant. People celebrated. The clip of his smug face for that night, the moment he smirked, the second he made his little power move, was now being reposted with one word flashing over it in bold red letters: fired. But while the city cheered, somewhere in a dimly lit office, Daniel Marsh sat completely still, staring at the email on his screen. Termination letter, final paycheck. All in one neat little package, like he hadn't just lost everything. His fingers hovered over his keyboard as if there was something he could type, something he could say that would change what had already been decided. He had worn that badge for 15 years, and it took just one night to lose it all. The silence in his apartment was deafening. No radio chatter, no calls from dispatch, no routine, no schedule, no backup waiting for him outside. Just him, alone, unemployed, and untouchable in the worst way possible. Because no department was going to hire him now, not after this. The footage would follow him for the rest of his life. And the worst part? It wasn't just the job he lost. It was the power, the authority, the certainty that no matter what, he'd always have the upper hand. Now he was just another name on a headline. And the world? The world had already moved on. The city had waited long enough. Too long. For days, the footage had played on every major network, the protests had only grown louder, and the pressure on city officials had reached a boiling point. Every statement they had put out before this, every generic promise of an ongoing investigation, every vague assurance that they were looking into the matter, had done nothing to calm the outrage. People weren't interested in bureaucracy. They wanted action, and they weren't waiting quietly for it. By the time noon hit, the streets around City Hall were packed with demonstrators, their voices blending into an unrelenting chorus of demands. Signs filled the air, bold, furious, unapologetic. Fire them all. Accountability now. We won't forget. City officials had tried to delay the inevitable, but they had run out of time. And so, at exactly 12 p.m., the mayor's office released the statement. There was no press conference. No camera-ready moment, just a cold, typed message sent to every journalist, every news outlet, every major publication. In light of recent events involving members of our police department, we want to reaffirm our commitment to accountability, justice, and the safety of every citizen in this city. The actions displayed in the now widely circulated footage do not reflect the values of this administration, nor the standards we expect from our law enforcement officers. It was calculated, carefully worded, the kind of statement that had been revised 100 times by legal teams before it ever saw the light of day. The kind of statement designed to sound strong while actually saying very little. But the people weren't interested in what the city claimed to stand for. They were interested in consequences. And then, finally, they got one. As of today, Officer Daniel Marsh has been officially terminated. Further internal investigations are ongoing, and we will continue to evaluate all personnel involved in this incident. We are committed to transparency and will be taking additional steps to ensure that incidents like this do not happen again. The words hit the news like a thunderclap. The first firing. It was immediate headline material. Justice served. City fires officer amid mayor scandal, police accountability, or damage control. City responds to public pressure, more firings coming. City officials promise ongoing investigation. Social media exploded. The news spread in seconds, flying across platforms, racking up millions of shares. Some people celebrated, calling it a step in the right direction. Others weren't so easily satisfied. Because one officer losing his job, that wasn't justice. That was self-preservation. a way for the city to throw someone under the bus while protecting the system that allowed it to happen in the first place. And people weren't falling for it. By the time the afternoon rolled around, the protests outside City Hall had grown. The chants were louder, the signs were bolder, the message was clearer. One down, who's next? Because everyone knew Marsh hadn't acted alone. The younger officer, the police chief, the entire chain of command that had let this happen in the first place, they were still there. And until real change happened, until every officer involved faced consequences, the public wasn't backing down. The city had made a promise, and now the people were going to make sure they kept it. The city didn't just want to clean up the mess, they wanted to rewrite the rules. For too long, incidents like this had ended the same way. Investigations that dragged on for months, empty promises of better training, disciplinary actions that amounted to nothing more than a slap on the wrist. But this time was different. This time, the outrage didn't fade after a week. The protests didn't die down. The headlines didn't disappear. And the mayor? He wasn't about to let this become just another scandal that people forgot about in a month. So, when city officials gathered behind closed doors to decide their next move, they knew one thing for sure. Whatever they did next had to be big. Something real. Something that couldn't be ignored. By the time the announcement was made, the world was already watching. The mayor stood at the podium, flanked by legal advisors, city council members, and community leaders. The press conference room was packed, reporters crammed into every available space, cameras rolling, live streams broadcasting the moment in real time. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. This city has had enough. His voice was firm, controlled, unshaken. The people have spoken, and they are absolutely right. Accountability should not be optional, consequences should not be delayed, and moving forward, they won't be. A slight pause, a moment for the weight of those words to settle. Then came the real news. Effective immediately, we are implementing a new policy. Any officer found to have engaged in biased policing, discrimination, or unlawful profiling will face automatic termination. No second chances. No loopholes, no delays. If you abuse your power, you lose it. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled to ask questions. Microphones were shoved forward. Camera shutters clicked frantically. Because this wasn't just talk. This was law. No more drawn-out investigations designed to buy time. No more administrative leave while the public forgot what happened. No more quiet transfers to another precinct. If you were caught abusing your badge, you were done. No appeals, no negotiations, no union protections. Just gone. The reaction was instant. Some people cheered. Some people doubted it would last. Some officers in the department panicked. Because for the first time, there was no wiggle room, no hiding behind standard procedure, no getting away with "I was just doing my job," no safety net, just accountability. And for those who had spent their careers wielding their authority however they pleased, it was a wake-up call. Because now, the rules had changed, and the system that had once protected them wasn't protecting them anymore. Something had changed. It wasn't loud, but it was felt. Officers moved differently now, spoke differently, thought twice before pulling someone over, before demanding answers, before throwing their weight around. Because now, there were consequences. The usual confidence, the untouchable attitude was gone, replaced by hesitation, a quiet, gnawing fear. Is this worth my job? Patrols were slower, commands were softer. Phones went up instantly whenever they approached someone. Nobody was taking chances. The public had learned that exposure works. And officers, for the first time in a long time, they were afraid. The old way was dead. Not wounded, not weakened. Dead. For too long, accountability had been an illusion. Something promised but never delivered. Something that always seemed just out of reach. But now, the mayor had done what no one thought possible. He tore it all down. The reforms weren't just symbolic. They weren't just for show. This wasn't about training sessions or revised policies that got buried in paperwork and forgotten in a month. This was real. Department-wide restructuring. New leadership, new policies, new oversight. No more internal reviews that led nowhere. Every officer complaint went straight to an independent civilian board, one that had real power. No more paid leave for misconduct. If an officer was under investigation, they were off the streets immediately. No more excuses, no more loopholes. If you abused your power, you lost it. Period. The department fought it. The unions pushed back. But it didn't matter, because the public, they weren't backing down either. The people had seen what happens when real change is demanded. They had seen officers hesitate, seen them realize that they weren't untouchable anymore. And the mayor? He didn't just want reform. He wanted a reset, a police force that actually served its community. Officers who were trained in de-escalation, not intimidation. A system that was built on justice, not control. It took time. It took fights. It took pushing through every barrier thrown in his way. But in the end, he won. And the city? The city was never going back to the way things were. For the first time in a long time, things felt different. Not in a way that could be summed up in a headline, not in a way that could be measured with statistics on a government report, but in the streets, in the way people walked a little lighter, in the way they weren't gripping their phones every time a patrol car rolled by, ready to hit record, in the way kids could ride their bikes without parents watching from the porch, silently bracing for something to go wrong. Because for once, there was no fear. The difference wasn't just in what changed, it was in what stopped. No more routine harassment, no more unnecessary stops for looking suspicious, no more questions that weren't really questions, just thinly veiled accusations in search of an excuse. And when officers did show up, they acted different too. They talked first. They didn't reach for their belts. They didn't assume the worst. They didn't come in looking for a fight, because they knew. They knew that if they crossed the line, they wouldn't be protected by the badge. They'd be fired. And for once, the community believed it, because they had seen it happen. The people in these neighborhoods had lived through generations of being treated like suspects in their own city. They had been promised reform before. They had heard all the speeches, the policies, the weird listening statements that never led to real change. But now they didn't have to hope things were different. They could feel it. It was in the way their voices finally mattered. In the way officers didn't just patrol their neighborhoods, they actually served them. And for the first time, people weren't just surviving the system, they were living outside of its shadow. He never thought this day would come. Not like this. Not with him standing outside the mayor's office, hands clasped together, waiting to be called in. Not with his uniform replaced by a plain dress shirt and slacks. No badge, no authority. Just a man. Just a man who had lost everything. When the assistant finally opened the door and gestured for him to enter, his stomach twisted. He had faced angry citizens, reporters, his own downfall. But this was different. This was the moment he had spent weeks avoiding. The mayor sat behind his desk, posture relaxed, but his eyes held none of the warmth that politicians usually wore in public. No fake smiles, no rehearsed lines, just waiting. The silence stretched. And for the first time in his life, the officer had no script to follow, no department lawyers backing him up, no handbook telling him what to say. It was just him, and he had to own it. His throat felt tight, but he forced the words out. "I came to apologize." The mayor didn't flinch, didn't offer a nod, didn't make this easy, so he kept going. "I was wrong. That night. Everything about it. I didn't see it then, but I see it now." He exhaled, glancing down at his hands. "I don't expect you to forgive me. He swallowed. "I needed to say it, face to face." The mayor leaned forward slightly, studying him. Then, finally, he spoke. "Why?" That single word held weight. The officer hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because if someone like me had done that to me, His jaw tightened. I'd never forget it. Silence again, but this time it felt different. The mayor let out a slow breath, nodding once. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. The officer had come as a man, not as a cop, not as someone expecting to walk away clean. And that was the first step. The silence was thick, heavy. It pressed against the walls of the office like an unspoken force, stretching out between them. The officer stood stiffly, his hand still clasped in front of him, like a man on trial. And in many ways, he was. Because this wasn't a conversation. This was judgment. The mayor's gaze didn't waver. He didn't fidget. He didn't let the weight of the moment shift in the officer's favor. He let him sit in it, let him feel every ounce of what he had done. And then, finally, he spoke. "I'm not going to forgive you." The officer flinched, just barely. He had expected it, but hearing it out loud, final, unflinching, absolute, it still hit hard. His fingers curled slightly, gripping nothing, pressing into his palms. But he didn't argue, didn't plead. Because what was there to say? He had made his choices. Now he had to live with them. The mayor leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk, his expression unreadable. "But," he continued, his voice calm, controlled, firm, "I hope you change." The officer swallowed. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an open door. It was a challenge. Because this wasn't about one night. This wasn't about just him. This was about every man who had ever worn the badge like a weapon. Every officer who had abused their power, knowing there would be no consequences. And the mayor wasn't here to offer absolution. He was here to say, prove it. Prove that you've learned. Prove that you understand. Prove that the man standing here today isn't the man who stood on that sidewalk, smirking, weaponizing his uniform like it made him untouchable. The officer nodded slowly, his throat tight. He turned to leave, stopping just before the door, and in that moment, he knew forgiveness would never come. But maybe change still could. It was just one night, one decision, one abuse of power that in another time, in another city, might have gone unnoticed, might have been swept under the rug, might have ended with a weak apology and a quiet reassignment. But not this time, not here, not now, because something shifted. It wasn't just about one mayor, one cop, one act of humiliation caught on camera. It was about every injustice that had come before it, every story that had been ignored, every protest that had been silenced, every voice that had been dismissed with the same tired excuses. And now, those voices weren't just being heard. They were demanding change. The firing wasn't just about one officer. The reform wasn't just about one department. The shift in the streets, the hesitation in officers who once moved with unchecked confidence, it all traced back to this. One moment, one reckoning, one reminder that power, when misused, will always come back to collect. The city wasn't the same anymore, and it never would be again.